Hello, everybody out there. This is David Rovics coming back to you with another episode of Discussions, a random sort of program that I host on some weekday mornings, usually at 10 a.m. Pacific, and it goes out as a podcast afterwards. You can find it if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts. And we are broadcasting live now on the Facebook pages of Cable Community Radio and Popular Resistance, among various other places. And I'm very glad to be spending the hour now with my old friend, Jonathan Matthew Smucker, who has been a very effective organizer for a very long time and an author as well. Wrote a wonderful book called Hegemony How-To, a roadmap for radicals, which explores the idea of organizing in ways that are actually effective. And it's great to have you with us, Jonathan. And
Hey, good, really good to see you. Yeah, happy to be talking with you today.
I mean, it seems like the subject material that you've been writing about for a long time now is more relevant than probably ever. And it's been relevant since I was young, very relevant. But it just seems to get more relevant. And but without it kind of, I don't know, I guess I was thinking we could just start a little with your experiences as an activist, which I'm guessing are a major reason why you realized there's a problem here, and that needs to be addressed. And this problem that we're talking about for folks tuning in here, I mean broadly, it's the subject is. I mean, I would define it as. I mean, you on your website, beyondthechoir.org. There's a bit of a religious reference there to the choir, perhaps. And so I like to talk about ecumenical organizing, inclusive forms of organizing that aren't cliquish and sectarian. And I got a lot of my vocabulary for talking about these things from hearing about these things from you, in fact. And so there's my little slightly more longer introduction of who we're talking to here. And I first met you I believe it was 1997, and you were a veritable teenager, I believe, in fact. And you were one of the organizers with the Minnehaha Free State, which was a very impressive effort in Minnesota in the 90s to ultimately failed effort, as they generally are, to prevent the new building of a new highway. Although I should note that there have been many successful efforts to prevent highways from being built in this country. That just happens not to have been one of them, but it was a very good one. Yeah. So, Jonathan, yeah, the subject of was it there? I mean, I'm guessing too. Also, it was there around Minnehaha Free State and that struggle, which was itself a very intersectional struggle, to use a slightly more modern term that I don't think we were using back then. It was a very intersectional struggle that was really bringing together groups that didn't necessarily have a lot of background of working together. And that was one of the most interesting things about it, as well as, I imagine, one of the more challenging aspects.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I learned a lot at that campaign for certain. Yeah, I was barely not a teenager. I was 98. I guess we met summer of '98 when I was 20 years old. And Yeah, and I had the basically the 3 years prior to that, I had dived headlong into the kind of activist the pockets of activist scenes that I found when I came of age in the mid '90s. I was raised. You mentioned the religious reference. I was raised pretty conservative Mennonite in Lancaster County, outside of a little town called Burdenhand, raised on a farm. Working class, very religious, pretty apolitical, but socially conservative. And it
But the
was,
Mennonite thing, I mean, for those who don't know, that is although you talk about it as being conservative and everything, and surely it is, but the Mennonites have a long pacifist tradition. I don't know, was that very influential when you were a kid?
yeah, yeah, for certain. I mean, what's interesting about it, I mean, Mennonites, just like so many other denominations, run the spectrum. So, a lot of progressives are like, oh, Mennonites, you're so progressive. I was like, yeah, those are the ones you meet. um, and so, yeah, while pacifism was a big part of it, it was the pacifism I was raised with was about the most depoliticized pacifism that you could possibly imagine, right? It kind of looked out for our own to make sure that we didn't have to do military service, but there was no political discussion behind it. It was just like, this is a matter of theology, just like baptism by choice was a matter of theology. And yeah, so, and don't get me wrong, like I'm not just, there are actually a lot of things that years later I really valued from being raised Mennonite, the sense of really strong community and mutual aid and elements of solidarity and mutual aid that were just totally stripped out of the money economy, right? Of childcare and all the stuff, and a sense of we're in this together and people aren't expendable. Like some of those things I really take with me, and I look at the left and I'm like, I wish we had some of these things, right? But then it came with the garbage too. It came with the patriarchy, the anti sexuality, homophobia, etc. So it was a mixed bag. But that said, I was politicized in high school through kind of a series of accidents. It was racism at my high school, and homophobia, and it was it was perpetuated by the people who I was friends with in junior high. And then, like, through a series of accidents, I kind of fell into, I started playing guitar in 8th grade. I fell into the artsy crowd and whatnot, and then was friends with more like artistic people and people of color at the school. And then those farm kids that I was friends with growing up, and not all farm kids, hashtag, but like some of them became these kind of perpetrators of racism at my high school. And I was politicized. I didn't have the vocabulary to be politicized. I just knew what was happening was wrong. And when I saw the school administration turned a blind eye to these acts of aggression, and when I saw the relationship of some of the aggressors with their parents being on the school board and things like that, it was like that was the structural kind of politicizing aspect. And long story short, at the same time I started reading about the global economy, I started reading. I just, how one thing leads to another. I started to become politicized. I started reading things. I started going to Mennonite Central Committee's Alternative Resource Library, which is in Lancaster County. Somebody turned me on to it. I started reading publications like Multinational Monitor, The Catholic Worker, New Internationalist, things like that. Started learning about union organizing. I was 16, 17. Then I started going to Mumia protests, Mumia Abu Jamal this is like 1995, 94, 95 in Philadelphia. And then I left home. I went hitchhiking all across the country, and I kind of dove headlong into, what I found of kind of an activist subculture. I lived in Catholic worker communities for 2 years, and I found Earth First, and that's around when I found the Minnehaha Free State, which was, ended up being a 16-month land occupation to stop highway rerouting, and it was a really interesting coalition that you named that included the American Indian movement, the Mendota Dakota, the Mendota Wakantan Dakota community, a more kind of liberal to, actually all over the place, neighborhood coalition, very mainstream neighborhood coalition, and then Earth First, and an environmental organization, Sierra Club was involved. And it culminated in this occupation of land with really, militant, nonviolent tactics and all sorts of tactics, legislative tactics, lawsuits. And that was really, that was my organizing boot camp. And it was organizing in a really rare sense where I was learning all sorts of things, from door knocking and talking to neighbors to like legal strategy, lawsuits, and legislative strategy, and direct action, and kind of arcs and media and communication skills. And it was really the first moment in my organizing work within like 3 years where there was a campaign where suddenly it dawned on me, wait a minute, we could win. And we didn't win, right? But winning became a real possibility in my mind. And what I realized, I kind of had some disillusionment that the previous 3 years, when I dove into the Catholic worker and a bunch of different protests, it was this really righteous space where I mean, it wasn't that people didn't want to win. It was just that like there was no foothold on how to get from point A to point B. Like we were in a historically weak time. It was, the
Yeah.
quote unquote end of history. It was there is no alternative. And it felt real. It was really hard. We didn't have power. And so,
And
I
people talked like, I mean, as they do, of course, about things like bearing witness and the idea of like at least somebody's going to pour blood on this missile silo, even if we have no power to do anything. I mean, that was the kind of I mean that it was and is a certain very important kind of element of the whole left scene, I guess that you're kind of coming out of. But this idea of winning is rather than just being morally right is really quite a concept, isn't it?
Yeah, and to be fair, I think there were a lot of people that understood that, that were like, hey, like I don't see how we can win, but like it's better to stand up and at least bear witness, at least register that, not all Americans stand with US imperialism and empire, but whatever it was, that and I agree with that, right? Absolutely, right? Like and a lot of these folks, my mentors in the Catholic worker movement at the time and whatnot, were people who had been part of, even like you mentioned, kind of the plowshares movement. Well, like when the plowshares movement came of age, like in the early 80s, it was in the context of major anti-nuclear campaigns, and it played a part within a broader context that wasn't just like, you know, you know, uh, doing things in a vacuum. But what I kind of found and became disillusioned with is that those dynamics, you can become accustomed to marginality. And not only can you become accustomed to marginality, you can become attached, even addicted to it. Because, look, and let's talk about for a second, the positive aspects of this, right? Standing up and being brave and risking your safety, possibly going to jail, all these different things for a cause is a tremendously important and personally and collectively empowering thing. Social movements need that kind of willingness by at least a solid core of people to sacrifice of themselves, to give, and it's actually the lifeblood of movements. It's irreplaceable. However, uh, you can become attached to that feeling and even start to kind of guard movement spaces and think like it's a threat when prominent people start saying the thing that you were just saying, right? Because it's like, oh, they're going to co-opt the movement, and I'm not saying co-optation fears are never valid, right? I am saying that, like, and I wrote an essay about this one time, but that like co-optation is an advance from total powerlessness, right? Like the problems movements face when powerful people are trying to co-opt what they're doing is a set of problems I would rather have any day than the problem of we are so weak that nobody wants to co-opt our message. Nobody wants to co-opt our movement, right? So yeah, that started coming to a head for me at the Minnehaha encampment. And the last thing I'll say, just to kind of bring it back to Minnehaha, is that it was complicated because Minnehaha had elements of both. It had elements of the story of the righteous few. I call it the story of the righteous few, right? It's the holding the candle in the wind, telling ourselves the story of like, we are the few who stand up. We're always going to lose. That's the way of life, right? There were elements of that, and then there were elements of like real pragmatism, and it all got mixed together, and I could see it playing out in lots of different ways, and so and I could see myself being guilty of it. It wasn't like I was like super. I mean, when you met me, like I was like running with the black bloc. I was like a crusty punk, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I love crusty punks, right? There's no diss, right? But I made a decision later to clean up, and I mean, you wouldn't know it now because it's COVID times, but
It's all
um,
relative.
it's all relative, and there's no right or wrong here, right? But like at the time, I was very deep in the subculture, right? I was speaking the language of the subculture. I was, had all these signals of how different I was from everyday people. And I was thriving in that subculture. I loved it. I felt a sense of community, of belonging. I loved that feeling. But I also had this feeling of like, you know what? Like, those people back where I'm from in Lancaster County, some of our values, they would actually agree with if we would meet them where they're at, if we would do some work to translate into their language.
Even
And
if it's
that,
just a matter of like bathing a bit more often and that sort of thing. Like, I mean, just a certain,
right, and
certain
just the
like
point about
being
bathing more
not
often.
stinking at a 3 foot distance, and yeah.
Yeah, so that was kind of the journey. And then, in the coming years I started, and the global justice movement took off, and that was a real moment of like, oh wow, like we have influence, we're shaping the narrative. And that was kind of the track that I went on, that I started Beyond the Choir as a project that was digging into these dynamics of why is the left so insular? Why do we talk to ourselves? Has it always been this bad, or has it gotten worse? Those were the questions I was wrestling with.
Yeah, which are just such really relevant and important questions, I think, for anybody who's been involved with the left forever. And I mean, one of the things that I sort of realize more and more as I read and, sort of get more familiar with history going way back is that this has been a problem for a long time, right? I mean, this kind of like this kind of culture of personal attacks and denunciation and I'm right and you're wrong and black and white thinking. I mean, it just kind of seems to be pervasive on the left, at least going back to the 1840s. And Karl Marx himself was very much engaged in these kinds of personal attacks. I mean, despite the fact that also Marx himself was also brilliant and was also like talking about these things that actually are very complex concepts that more than one thing can be true at the same time. I mean, these concepts like dialectical materialism, it seems like so important to actually understanding how we can build an ecumenical movement, but at the same time, like his own behavior and the behavior of so many others have not been, has been characterized by a lot of sort of personal attacks. And I guess it's very complex why people engage in these behaviors and why it's so pervasive, and whether people believe it's the way to go, or it's going to get them somewhere, or they're going to win through these kinds of attacks, or if they're just defending the moral high ground and not thinking in terms of victory. But I mean, it seems it's a complex picture and it goes way back. But it seems to me in my life, it's getting worse, like
Mm-hmm.
notably worse. And it was scary when I was young, but it was more marginal, and it's getting more mainstream. It's getting very mainstream, in fact, I would say. And I wonder, do you share that all what I was just talking about?
Yeah, I would give some caveats and break it down a bit. I think you identifying this long-term trend, going back to the 1800s, et cetera, is real. I think it's also really important to look at the specific historical junctures that have compounded these problems, right? So, like I said, when I started looking at these questions, one of my questions is like, is it worse now than it's been? Because um, and basically, then that led to. I mean, at first I was really interested in the social psychological dynamics of like. So I studied things like signaling and groupthink and how social capital systems work within groups, and even inverted systems of social capital where within a movement space the signals of the dominant society are like reversed, and you get capital for signaling the opposite thing, right? So nonconformity as a conformist strategy, like all these different things. I was interested in that kind of, on some level, ahistoric social psychological dynamics of groups, and I actually think it's really helpful. Like I'm constantly having to fight this battle with like both sociologists and leftists of like actually thinking that the social psychological level is important. Not It's important because it is one of the most primary levels that we have to navigate as organizers and as leaders, right? It's not because it explains everything in history and economics and everything. It doesn't, right? But it's this level that really paralyzes us when we don't get it right. And so I was first interested in that, but then it drove me to a more historical, sociological level. So I think there's a couple things to parse out. One is sectarianism and the addiction to marginality are that those are two different things that compound each other, right? They relate to each other. But like Marx, for example, was not addicted to marginality, right? But did have some of this overly polemical, kind of comes off as an asshole all the time things.
Yeah.
I think that there's a moment there where a lot of the socialist and communist leaders back then were not at all addicted to marginality. Like they wanted power, they were really clear on it, but they did have problems with sectarianism, and that's an interesting thing to look at. And then there's the more, I think, more inherent in the anarchist thread. Um, uh, this like also reaction, like an ideological justification for the application of power. And that's not to dismiss all anarchism wholesale. Like there's really complex things in that tradition, and anarchists who make no apology about building and wielding collective power. But it's interesting. So I think in our era, the past 40 years, and then we can look at the past 10 years, the rise of neoliberalism and the individualism in the culture has compounded both sectarianism and this addiction to marginality, attachment to marginality, for a number of reasons. One of which is just that the logic of collective action, until the past 10 years, it's starting to make a comeback. But before that, it's just like not even there in people's heads, right? It's like, even you look at, I think one of the symptoms of this is in academia is you read the social movement literature, and these are pretty left-leaning people in sociology, and they're using frameworks about like social movement entrepreneur. They're not a fucking entrepreneur, right? They're a leader, right? It's a collective enterprise. It's not, it's not like these entrepreneurial individualistic frameworks we're just like colonizing everyone's thinking. And I think it's kind of a weird accident of history or irony of history that like right at the time that Reagan was coming to power with this narrative of like the scariest words in the English language are I'm here from the government or whatever, and like the government's not the solution to our problems, the government is the problem. That anarchism and this anti-statism were becoming the kind of zeitgeist of the left in Europe and in the United States. And it's there, and then you see, like in the intellectual history, like the rise of Foucault, and who is brilliant and offers so much in terms of deconstruction, but no interest in the project of constructing the collective power that we need and all the things that come with it, which includes, in my opinion, leadership, collective discipline, right? Like that collective discipline as a concept is so foreign right now. If you look in like left Twitter, it's like what's that, right?
Right.
Um,
Can
so
we?
yeah,
I don't
please.
want to. No, but well, okay. I think I want to. If we can talk about specifically I think it relates to so much you're talking about. If we can talk about what was going on in 2001, just prior to 9/11, you know, just to summarize why I think it's particularly relevant. Like, I mean, this is, of course, I guess if you were only a couple years before that, you were a crust punk, but you sure changed a lot over those couple notable years during the course of the global justice movement at the time, which was quite a time. Every day it was quite something for a couple years there. And prior to 9/11, there were plans for yet another every 6 months for those who weren't there or were, whatever. uh, every 6 months, the IMF and the World Bank would have meetings in Washington, D.C., and there would be big protests sometimes, which delayed their meetings, or a lot of civil disobedience, alternative conferences. All sorts of groups were having sort of convergences during these meetings and accomplishing all sorts of different things in the process. And of course, at the time, you had governments in power like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who was opposed to these kinds of free trade deals that were benefiting the global elite, and so you had people in positions of power who were very much on sort of our side of this equation, And then in the context of on the streets, you were looking at, you, Jonathan, were one of the organizers of what was to be, I think, a very large protest involving a lot of civil disobedience, but which was derailed by 9/11.
Mhm.
But basically, what had been going on for years prior to that was these events, these protests involving a lot of civil disobedience were and a lot of education, a lot of popular education. It was really putting a movement on the map. It was putting a lot of ideas on the map. We were making a lot of progress globally in a lot of different ways that would be far too it's far too many to try to list. But it was a real movement. It was a global movement, and there was this ongoing situation where, although we were getting tens of thousands of people coming out to protests and ready to risk arrest and doing all sorts of other popular education. There was a lot going on, and then there was also this phenomenon that, which I think everybody pretty much watching this broadcast now or in the next few days or whatever are going to be familiar with, which is the Black Bloc and the question of what is the role of the Black Bloc in these protests? And you were engaged in what seemed to many of us at the time to be some extremely impressive negotiations with all kinds of people involved with the Black Bloc, which you were, of course, coming out of, very recently, even in activist time, perhaps, even though maybe it had been a year, but and and there was there was what I believe was pretty much consensus that around tactics that was being developed around that protest, which was a new thing at the time. This idea of having consensus around tactics, a consensus around collective action. And I don't know if you feel like I'm characterizing this whole in my summary of what was happening and your role in it is accurate, but I'm just trying to set the stage and see if you got some
Yeah,
things to talk about in there.
it was a really that was a wild time. Those 2 years, I ended up playing a role in the global justice movement that was kind of a rare role, very, very unique, and I was uniquely positioned for it. Like you said, I had credibility as like an anarchist and Earth Firster from the Minnehaha Free State, and like this militant direct action campaign where, yeah, like we used Black Bloc as a tactic. We did lockdowns. We locked our necks to things. I was arrested, I think, 7 times during that campaign. There was like a lot going on, and I would come to the table with the labor organizers, the nonprofits, the more mainstream, these groups. And I mean, right. So this idea of collective discipline that I was talking about, I think really comes up here. The push I was making, I was like, look, you're an anarchist, so am I. I actually, like, just to be clear, I don't identify as an anarchist anymore, even though I've been very influenced by that tradition. And, respect people who are, right? But at that time, I was like, you're an anarchist, I'm an anarchist too. Let's be serious, right? Like, anarchism, like, are you attached to the fashion that has married anarchism over the past 15 years with the marriage of punk rock and anarchism, which has nothing to do with the history of anarchism? Are you attached to your, individualistic right to do whatever tactic you want without regard for how it affects other people, impacts other people? Or are you attached to collective liberation as your North Star and, figuring out how to work with other groups and to, create a means where, like, look, if you believe in your ideas, are you up for creating a space where you can articulate your vision and be part of a broader alignment of forces where there's no chasm in between that actually allows more people to be politicized into your camp, right? Or are you going to go off and do your own thing without regard for how it affects other people? I mean, it was more complicated than that. It was really messy. And they're not simple arguments. It actually involves really patient work. It involved like breakfast and lunch and coffee with people, meetings, like just a lot of work that could unravel really, really easily, because, distrust is really easy to sow. So yeah, I was doing that. I had actually done that for April 16, 2000. which was the first big protest against the IMF World Bank, the first big protest after Seattle. And that was pretty successful in doing that. And then
the
we were
first
gearing
time
up
I
for
ever saw police try to kill people with a motor vehicle.
it. Was wild. Yeah. But that protest was very, very successful in terms of how the different ends of the kind of tactical and ideological spectrums work together. And yeah, we were getting ready. I mean, it's like a weird irony of history, but there was a Tuesday morning in the fall of 2001 where we were getting ready for a press conference to announce the formation of a broad new left coalition. The head of John Sweeney was going to speak, the head of the AFL-CIO, the head of major environmental organizations like Friends of the Earth and Sierra Club, other labor unions, and this big direct action coalition. We were gathered together. I walked into the building for our 9 a.m. meeting and saw that one tower was on the TV, and then watched the second one hit. So yeah, I mean, let's actually pivot from this to the other thing that we were talking about, the comparison, because I think it's really interesting comparing that moment. In some ways, I feel like the global justice movement was way ahead of its time in that we were at the tail end of a not quite tail end, but like we were at a long period of decline of movements and infrastructure, attacks on organized labor, et cetera. Like I arrived at the scene, I describe it as like something like a political orphan, like having to make my own way, right? And suddenly Seattle happens, which is like kind of this like coming out party, and suddenly there's this big visible movement. And it actually resonated with a lot of people. There were surveys that showed like 70% of Americans thought corporations have too much power, et cetera. But it was, and the internationalism was phenomenal, actually, when you compare it to today, too, right? It was like from the get-go, like it was like the movement in the U.S. saw itself as joining a movement that had originated in the global South against austerity, structural adjustment programs, IMF, World Bank, et cetera. And that was the narrative. And it was like there was actually a tremendous amount of collective discipline. There were actually some specific organizations like Earth First, like the Ruckus Society, that had built a cadre of, direct action people that at least had, maybe they weren't that ideologically developed, right? But like had tactical discipline, right? Understood the need to work together and to trust each other and all that.
A lot of skills, so many skills that those trainings taught people. And at the time, I was like, seemed like everywhere where I went, there was another training happening, and I thought, how many trainings do we need? Like, can't we have an action? But then after now that the trainings aren't happening, now I so realize how important they were, and how and I feel stupid for any time I ever complained about that, another training going on.
That's it. I mean, now we're in a moment where the culture, like political opinion, is on our side, right? Like there's a crisis of authority in the culture that's been rising for 15 years, that's at a head. People are ready for the solutions that we're ready to suggest, but like we're really in a race against time to rebuild the kind of collective power, organization, and skills, and to create a culture of collective discipline. I actually think it's important here to not see the dialogue of Twitter, et cetera, to give it, I mean, it's coloring everything, but I think under the surface, there are actually far more skilled leaders and campaigners now than there were 20 years ago. It's just that the dominant culture in the left really mirrors the economy of attention that's structured by Twitter, right? Where instead of it being like we're collectivist, it's an individual self-advancement competition in this economy of attention shit that makes it so that instead of building up our leaders, where the shortcut to attention is to attack anything that gains traction. And there's really powerful things, right? There's powerful things in that, like, look, the power to destroy an individual's reputation can be a really incredible power of a movement. But in a moment when we don't have much structural power, it can become addictive, where that's the only power that we're exercising instead of like figuring out how we change policy, how we, all these things. So I think that's some of what we're up against. It's that it's not just that individualism that has arisen from neoliberalism, although that is a huge piece of the backdrop that makes people right for this. But then on top of that, there's this economy of attention in the social media world that is, I think it's training a whole crop of hopefully not would be skilled organizers in all the wrong ways, right? It's teaching them that the way to lead is to advance yourself, to self-promote, to like, but in some ways, I mean, the hopeful part of me is like, look, I know so much really good on the ground work that's happening across the country. It's actually making a huge difference, from Sunrise Movement to groups like the one that I founded, Pennsylvania Stands Up, to smaller organizations that have a huge punch, like Justice Democrats, that were key in getting like AOC and building the squad. There's so much really important work going on, and I think what gives us a really messed up view of it is the people doing. It's kind of like the workhorses and the show horses, right? The people doing the best work aren't spending all their time self-promoting and elbowing their way into this economy of attention. And so the self-promoters are dominating and giving a false picture of the most relevant work that's going on.
Yeah, it's so true, and I wonder. I mean, it seems like this whole dynamic predates anti-social media, but it's all sort of made much more amplified by that whole phenomenon. And I wonder, and it's sort of like, it seems like the phenomenon of social media that kind of forces the hand, like something, this phenomenon has to then be dealt with even more urgently than before, because it's so distorted and amplified by Twitter and Facebook. And but what's the I mean, so can you talk more about what the approach is that can that can try to change this sort of flaw in the culture? I mean, and if you think that's an accurate kind of description, and I
Yeah,
mean, I mean, is this phenomenon that we're talking about, that this problematic phenomenon, like, I mean, I guess it's many things, and you can call it many things, and it has many different aspects to it. So it's not just one thing, but it's there is this sort of individualistic quality to it, and this I'm better than you kind of, I'm a better anarchist, I'm a better whatever kind of thing, and this denunciatory, this need to disavow, to denounce, to find separate, to find a reason why you don't have something in common with someone rather than what you do have in common. I mean, that seems to be the general kind of impetus, and I wonder what's the how do we try to address that? And then, and also, it seems to me, and I know I'm asking something that's way more than one question here, but like, it seems to me that even if we can try to address that basic problem and have vocabulary to talk about it, there's always this problem of provocateurs, of the actual police. And this is something I think bears some talking about, and it's something that you've personally had a lot of experience with, of provocateurs within government agencies doing things to divide and conquer the movement through covert and overt ways. Yeah. So I mean, it's how do we try to advance the cause of real solidarity and not being cliquish, and also facing the problem of provocateurs, be they FBI or Russians, I should add. I mean, it's not like we're not talking about one entity here. We're talking, and there's all kinds of provocateurs out there who have all kinds of different reasons, both in the real world and on the internet, to mess with us. And yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then there's also just careerists in their own right whose whole thing is their own self promotion, who don't really care about collective aims, and
No, I
those
mean,
things
there are
all.
Twitter feeds where all that you see, I mean, some of the people who criticize me, I look at their Twitter feeds and I see nothing but taking down fellow leftists.
Yeah, yep. A friend of mine once told me, I don't know if they invented this line or not, but it's like, if you're really mad and you want to feel your impact, the easiest thing to do is always punch the person right next to you, right? And that I think that's just a phenomenon in the left. So there's a couple. I mean, I think it's complex, and I think it's really hard work. Um, and so one thing I with the historical parallels, real quick tangent here. Todd Gitlin's old book about the way I forget what it's called, the way the mass media impacted collective leadership and group decision making and collective culture in the late 60s, like with SDS and what became the Weather Underground, et cetera, and the Black Panther Party, is really a worthwhile read. I can't remember what it is. The whole world was watching. I can't remember. But it's really parallel, that this influence of how self-appointed leaders could become self-appointed spokespeople using the mass media, and the way that could really throw off collective discipline and collective decision making, and kind of, you become a self-appointed spokesperson, and you find yourself in a position of being able to kind of like command the movements, right? It's like,
Jonathan, is self-appointed the right term? Because I'm just curious if that's exactly what you mean. Because are you talking about when people become spokespeople because the media makes them spokespeople? Like, I mean,
yeah,
that's because I'd slightly bristle at the self-appointed term, because I do know people that the media turned into celebrities, and they really did everything possible to avoid being the white male squatter in Norway who is the representative
totally.
of all the
Yeah,
squatters, but they just couldn't. I mean, I've seen it happen where like the media shows up and there's like dozens of people around, and the guy is saying like, talk to them. Look, the
totally,
Afghans are on a
totally.
hunger strike. Talk to that
Yeah,
Afghan. He's their representative. But they wait for this white guy to finally say something, and then
yeah.
he's on the news
Yeah, no,
again.
no, you make a great point, right? And it's a mix, right? I mean, one is just to know the media have their own incentives, right? And we need collective strategies around how to engage it. But yeah, some self-appointed, like Jerry Rubin, for example, like, yeah, maybe the media helped to make him a celebrity, but he sure wasn't arguing. Um, and back in Gitlin's time, Gitlin's still here, but back in the late 60s, right? So those dynamics really, with the mass media, really did a number on movements and how they operated. And now I think we're seeing uh, a new form of that with social media, where the spokespeople and the self promoters is much broader, and so it's socializing a lot more people um, into that world. So what do we do? I mean, I think that the solution lies in organizations. And I mean, a really interesting organization in all of this, for example, is DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, of which I'm a proud dues-paying member. And I feel like the scope of how this plays out is very visible in DSA, right? Where you've got people doing great organizing work, and then you've got some people who all they do is kind of what you said on social media, and you have everything in between, right? And so it's a context where I think the solutions, right, are through organization, right? It's like actually developing better culture in our organization around behavior and incentives for that, for people to actually show up in good ways, in ways that are more about promoting the collective. Because the solution here isn't don't use social media, right? It's a powerful tool, but just like the solution um, in the 60s isn't don't engage with the mass media. Like, you need to reach a mass audience, of course, but it is that we need to have collectivist strategies for engaging here, or else it's going to tear us apart. And so, I used to do these trainings about these social dynamics. I'm working on a revised curriculum right now that is more about the specific dynamics of social media and how it plays into this. And basically, it's a curriculum that does that and juxtaposes it with some different models of collective organization formation, cadre development, leadership development, historically, in different historical situations, from like communists in the 1930s to different to SNCC, to different movements, right? And yeah, I think ultimately the solution lies in collectivist solutions, and leaders have a specific role to play in modeling good behavior, And in, I write about this in Hegemony How-To without specifically addressing the social media dynamics. That, for example, like,
Can you define hegemony, by the way? Sorry.
yeah, let me come back to that in just a
Okay.
second, because it's
Yeah.
but so, I basically say, like, look, if the meeting's over and all the people who are seen as leaders huddle together, that sets a culture where the most important people are talking to themselves, and everybody wants to elbow their way in.
Mm.
If those people who are seen as leaders, instead of the meeting's over, they go and they check in with the person who is new to the meeting, with the person who looked uncomfortable, and they're oriented toward the periphery of the group. That sets the not just the model, it actually defines and subverts, helpfully, the social capital system within the group, right? Because what happens is groups have social capital systems where they want to signal belonging in the group. They want to signal service to the group. They want to signal the group's values. And a shortcut to that always is to kind of like move toward the center of the group as much as you can, and to move toward the important people, etc. And so leaders have a responsibility they have to take responsibility for subverting that. And the really good example is in SNCC. God, I'm forgetting the organizer's name right now. It'll come to me. But people would come down to the office, new volunteers from the north, from more middle class, upper middle class backgrounds. They'd come to volunteer with SNCC, and they would come and they would go to meet him, and he would always be sure to be doing some menial task, like scrubbing the toilet, sweeping the floor. And they'd ask for this guy, right? And then he'd take off his glove and shake their hand, right? And it's modeling that. It's modeling good behavior, and it's setting the cultural. It's setting, I call it framing the hardcore, because framing the hardcore, it can be doing something really self-referential, like some crazy tactic that is alienating, or it can be, in the case of SNCC, like hardcore is going and talking to poor rural voters who you don't even know how to talk to at first, failing, and then learning how to do it, right? So the hardcore becomes something that is oriented toward engaging the broader base. And that's some of what we have to do. We have to change our social capital systems so that, the model behavior, the behavior that gets people social points, is the collective oriented behavior. It's knocking doors. And there is some of that. You see that, in DSA Twitter, right? Where it's like, the model behavior is like knocking doors for Bernie, or knocking doors for AOC, or talking to your neighbors about housing or about labor. It's actually lifting up the shit work to the stuff that we should be lifting up. Hegemony, did I do that?
Yeah, what's hegemony? I was going to ask you that at the beginning, which would have been appropriate, given that was in the title of of your book on this very subject.
I mean, I used the word in the book as a provocation, right?
Because it is a very unusual use of the term.
Yeah, well, in modern years, sure, but not if you read Gramsci, right? Not if you read Lenin, mostly Gramsci, right? So I was raised, right? I was reading, like I'd read Chomsky, and hegemony is something that the United States is hegemonic in the global order, right? Like white supremacy is like, white supremacist culture is hegemonic in the cultural system. Patriarchy is so you think of hegemony as something that we stand against, that we stand outside of, that we're inevitably kind of holding our candle in the wind toward. But I define hegemony kind of along the lines of Gramsci, that hegemony is predominant influence or power within a broader relationship. And so, suspending the question of state power for a second, I talk about it first through a cultural lens, and that that basically there's no such thing as no hegemony, right? Because of how language and meanings work, right? Language means shared meanings. And those shared meanings, you and I can point to a four-legged creature that barks and wags its tail and both call it a dog, right? Well, that seems very benign and no real ideological content. But when we start getting into concepts about money, economy, politics, those concepts aren't neutral. They're defined in particular ways. And those concepts have bearing for power relationships, right? And there's no way around having common meanings. Without common meanings, there's no communication. So it's actually in our interest to define the common sense assumptions of the society, not as like greed is good or we have to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but as, from each according to their need, to each according to their ability, to each according to their need, or do unto others as you would have others do unto you, or workers of the world unite, right? Those are hegemonic or not hegemonic contents, depending on the, like we are the 99%, right? That's pretty good. So
even democratic socialist, that's pretty good, right? I mean, these two words together, whatever people think of the words individually, when you put them together, they make so much more sense even to just anybody than one word by itself.
Exactly. So my starting place with the hegemonic contest is the contest over meanings and symbols. And I assert that how symbols are meant, who can claim them, etc., matters profoundly. It's a contest that you can't escape from. You can eschew the contest, but somebody is still winning it, and it is in our interest to contend and to win that contest, right? Constantly. So that's the first assumption. And then the second, is more complex, and it goes to state power, and it's to say, like, we're actually interested not just in changing the popular meanings, but you can change that. You can have a situation where 90% of the people agree with you, but if 10% of the people still have the power, or 10% of the people support the even smaller number of people who have power, well, that's no good, right? We're not just gonna kumbaya until everybody agrees with us. We are going to make the people who don't want to redistribute, hoarded resources and wealth, redistribute it. We actually have an interest in redistributing wealth and power in society and in shaping policy. And it's this is not to throw under the rug the complexity and the moral and strategic complexities of power, and how power's corrupting influence, the tendency toward bureaucracy, the tendency toward authoritarianism. These are real things to wrestle with, and that the history of the 20th century really, there are real reasons why anarchism came to the fore. When you look at things like Stalinism, when you look at Nazism, when you look at the ability of mass organized industrial society, the power that it can wield against the vulnerable, there are real reasons for us to be cautious about that power. But caution doesn't abscond us from having to, we can't afford to let the power hungry have all the power. We have to stand up and come up with systems and dive into the mess. That's basically my where I've come from, kind of my anarchist background, to a politics of hegemonic contest, I would say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Although when you're talking about anarchism and anarchists and the different periods in history, I mean, it's also like one of these. I mean, not to digress to too much of a tangent here, but it's like we're talking about a word that's so ill-defined, right? I mean, because the kind of organizing you're talking about as a positive is also anarchist organizing, depending on who's defining the term. Right, like
right.
IWW style anarcho-syndicalism is very in keeping with the kind of positive ecumenical organizing methods and goals that you're talking about. Would you say?
Yeah, or study Spain, in the Spanish Revolution / Spanish Civil War. Like there's all sorts of complex ideas that are not kind of the caricatures. Unfortunately, I think some of the most ardent definers of anarchism in recent years have gone for more of what I call a politics of withdrawal, and of, basically it's like we will win by building Occupy Wall Street, the encampment, spreading those encampments, and eventually everybody will join them and capitalism will crumble. And I think that is a utopian, in the bad sense of the word, um, uh, delusional, I would say, to use a strong word, version of anarchism. But yes, your point is fair. Anarchism is a rich tradition that has really complex articulations and overlaps with socialism in so many ways.
But movements kind of like whether they sprout up. I mean, even hearing you talk about now we're definitely going on a tangent here, but even when talking about when you were growing up in the early '90s and the publications that you were familiar with, like the New Internationalist and the authors like Noam Chomsky that you were familiar with. I mean, of course, you like everybody else, you're a product of your times, and that's what you're familiar with, and so you kind of like. I mean, in a way, it's sort of like a nice little advantage to have become familiar with Chomsky at a early age, for example, like, compared to somebody else who just didn't have that opportunity. And then the idea of, all of us taking over parks at the same time, I mean, it might make as much sense as the harmonic convergence did to people who thought if we all meditated at the same time in 1984, we're going to, you know, cure pollution or something, but there were people who really believed it, and for some of them, I guess maybe they didn't have much to go on. So,
Well, and to be clear, that tactic of occupation spreading across the country, I was part of it. I was spreading it. It made all the sense in the world as a tactic
as
within
a
an
tactic,
art.
not as a goal. Yeah. I
Exactly.
mean, not as I loved it. I think, yeah, the physical space phenomenon is such an important thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So I do have to go in a minute, so maybe we should do one last question, or however you want to do.
Yeah, I was just we started a couple minutes late. I was going to notice the top of the hour, and now here we are. But yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's been such a pleasure, and I think that's just great. I don't want to make you go over time. You got something coming right up. So go to
Yeah,
beyondthechoir.org and check out and read your book. And it needs an audiobook version. You got an audiobook version?
I
Or
don't yet, but I'm
no?
hoping to come out with one when my new book comes out. To come out
Oh,
with one for
fantastic.
Hegemony How-To. And yeah, you can order the book at hegemonyhowto.org. Um,
Hegemony what?
hegemonyhowto.org.
Hegemonyhowto.org.
Yeah, and so
Fantastic.
you can order it there from AK Press directly. There's also the Amazon option, but
And what's the
you
new
know,
book?
the new book is called "Fuckers at the Top." It has a little asterisk over the U. A practical guide for overthrowing America's ruling class. And when will it be out? That's the big question. I'm a little off schedule, so in the
Can't
next year.
imagine why. Yeah, good, good.
Yeah, but really good talking with you, David.
Yeah.
I'm always down for talking about these questions. I think, just I guess a final word I would say is, despite it all, I'm hopeful because, there's always a lot of garbage happening. There's always a lot of toxicity. But the God, you look at this generation, you look at millennials and Generation Z, and I look at the people, when you met me and I was 20 years old at Minnehaha, I look at the 20-year-olds that I've been working with like Sunrise Movement, etc., and how far advanced they were, compared to everybody my age at that time, in terms of tactical know-how, strategic know-how, understanding of history, and a sense of collective and political agency. I mean, we have a crop of young, savvy organizers who are mad as hell, who is the most progressive and most racially diverse generation in American history. And when they come to power, look out, world. It's gonna be a different day, in my opinion. We'll see.
Ah, here, here. Let's hear it for optimism. I just like the optimism. Talk to you soon, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, David. Bye.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for tuning in to this discussion with Jonathan Matthew Smucker. And go to beyondthechoir.org and check out his wonderful books and other content and upcoming book. And let's see, tomorrow, Saturday, 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, I'll be doing a little concert from right here in my living room. And on Monday, Memorial Day, there will be a gathering that I'll be singing at Kelly Butte here in Portland, Oregon. If you're local, it'll be actual in the real world physical gathering, 1 p.m. Pacific time on Monday, Memorial Day at Kelly Butte. Hope to see folks there who are local and folks who are not local online tomorrow at the same time, 1 p.m. Pacific, on some of these channels that you're looking on anyway. And yeah, remember, mutual aid will get us through. Don't pay the rent unless you really have to. Trust your neighbors. Collective action gets the goods. Bye for now.